Hi guys, welcome to the channel. We're going to be looking at the basic fundamentals of HTML and CSS and just web development in general really. There's a whole lot to unpack, so we won't get through absolutely everything, but we'll try to cover as much material as we can. And I would just like to point out that I'm no expert myself, I'm still learning, so if I do get any information slightly wrong then I do apologise. Feel free to leave it in the comments. And on that note, let's get straight into it. I'd like to start by referencing this video by a creator called SuperSimpleDev. There's tons of really useful info in here, and he probably goes a lot more in depth than I do in this video, so if you've got 6.5 hours to spare then go ahead and watch that. But what I'm going to try and do is just compile all the information from this video and other videos and basically try my best to simplify it for the viewer. His video will be linked in the description, and thanks again to SuperSimpleDev. Okay, the first thing you're going to want to do is download Visual Studio Code. Don't get it mixed up with the Visual Studio IDE here, it's this code editor at the bottom. Once it's loaded up, hit download or click the little arrow if you want to choose what operating system you want to download it for. I'm going to go Windows 64-bit and then just download it and install it like you would any piece of software. Feel free to use any, but Studio Code is nice. Then you're going to want to create a new folder on your desktop and call it something like HTML CSS Learning. This will just help you organize all your files. Now from within your freshly installed Studio Code, open up that folder you just created. I saved mine to my desktop, so I'm just going to go to Desktop and there it is. Now it should open up here on the left hand side. Now create a new file and call it something like website.html. You need the .html so your computer knows it's a web page that you're making. Now, HTML syntax is a little bit different to most other languages. It's comprised of tags, which is just elements surrounded by these less than and greater than symbols. The top one is the opening tag and the bottom one is the closing tag. Every opening tag needs a closing tag, well, except for a select few, but we'll go over that later. First off, let's go over the basic elements that any website you've ever visited is made up of. This first one's unique in the sense that it only gets used once at the start of your code. It basically just tells the browser that you want to use all the most up-to-date properties for HTML. All of your code that will make up your website will go in between these two HTML tags. Next up is your head tag. You don't directly see everything that's inside of this code, but it's all happening in the background. Things like your title, styles, fonts you want to import, stuff like that. Now, using the title tags, name your page something like My First Website. Notice how I've wrote this line of code all on one line. This is fine for now, but we'll get into formatting pretty soon. Then we have the body tag. Everything you see on your website will be inside of the body tag. Before we start visualizing our code, let's go to the left here and install an extension called Live Server. This is a really handy extension for development. It basically means you don't have to keep refreshing your page every time you make a change. Anytime you save your file, it'll update your page. Now just right click and select Open with Live Server. So now at the tab at the top of the page you should see My First Website, or whatever you decided to name it. Since I've only got one monitor, I'm going to arrange my desktop something like this, just to make the development process a bit easier. You can also drag this bar in a little bit, just to make a bit more space for your code editor. I'm not going to talk too much about Visual Studio Code, but there are tons of features from within this software that you can use. Like, for example, this little scrolly screen thing, not really sure what you'd call it, but it's really handy for if you want to pinpoint certain parts of code because you've got a little preview. Or you can expand the outline or timeline down here in the Explorer panel, which is pretty useful if you want to maybe debug or stuff like that. You can also choose what you want to show or hide from within the Explorer tab. And then down here you've got the settings, which there's so much that you can possibly change. I'm not even going to go into it, but yeah, just take a look. You've got all the most commonly used ones like autosave or font size, and you can search at the top if you want to find anything in particular. But this is where you'd find any settings you might want to change. Okay, let's type some text between the body tags. Hit Ctrl S or File Save, and there you can see it at the top left of your page. But this text is so small and hard to read, so let's add some styling to it using CSS. To do this, we're going to look at a new element called the P element, short for paragraph. Now type something in between it, and as you can see it's pretty much the same, aside from a little bit of extra margin, but that's just because every element comes with a bit of margin to begin with. But before we get into that, let's just format this code a little bit so it's a bit more coherent and easy to read. Let's just space these top two lines out a little bit, and then we'll space out the title element so that it goes over the course of 3 lines, just like the P element. Okay, nice, that's looking a little bit cleaner now. Okay, now let's look at styling our text. There's a few different ways we can do this. We can do it using classes, which sounds like a complicated code term, but it's really just a way to target specific elements. A quick way to define a class is by typing the name of an element followed by an ellipsis. Oh, real quick, let me just show you how your text is formatted by default. Notice how I've typed this over 2 lines, but on the web page it just shows it on 1. That's just the way HTML works. If you want it to cover 2 lines, then you need to use a break tag. As you can probably guess, this will just break up the text and put it on a new line. It doesn't need a closing tag. There we go, now the text covers 2 lines. But let's just delete that text and let's go back to styling. So I'm just going to type in here, text that I want to style. Now to style things, we're going to need a style element. This contains our CSS code that allows us to style anything. And since you don't directly see the styling on the web page, it goes inside the head tag, which is kind of like the brains of our website. And as mentioned previously, anything that you do see on the web page will go inside the body element. It'll start to make more sense as we go on. Anyway, let's put the style element here below our title. We don't have to worry about classes just yet because we can style all paragraph elements, but we'll find out why classes are important soon. For now, let's type the name of the element we want to style, so in our case P, followed by these curly braces. Let's start by simply changing the font size. You do this by typing font-size and then colon and whatever size you'd like your text to be, followed by px, which stands for pixels. We're going to go for 32, and make sure you remember the px, otherwise it won't work. There we go, that's a pretty good size now. We can also change our font by typing font-family, followed by whatever font you'd like to use. Let's go for Arial. And now that's updated the font for us. As a bit of a failsafe, you can add another font separated with a comma, and if you can't use the first one, it'll use the second one. And you can do as many as you want, I believe. Okay, but say I had another paragraph of text, one that I wanted to style differently, or maybe not style at all. This is where using the class attribute would come in handy. So let's just type some more text in a new paragraph. I'm just going to type text that I do not want to style. Now save it so it reflects on our web page. Now as you can see, it's adhered to the rules that we've given to all P elements. But let's try giving our first paragraph a class attribute. Just type class equals and the name of the class you would like inside quotations. We'll just name it styled text like that. Now let's change the class properties. As you can see, typing styled text like this hasn't worked because it's blue, it should be yellow. To target a class, you need to put a dot before it, or a period, whatever you want to call it. So now only the first paragraph has been styled, the one with the class. So if we were to give the second paragraph the same class attribute, well, they'd give it the same style. There we go. Pretty simple, right? Now let's try creating a button and styling that. So let's just get rid of this second paragraph. And creating a button is pretty simple, you just use the button element. Now any text between these tags will be inside of your button. Let's just populate it with something generic like click me. Now save the file and we have a button. Now give this button a class so we can target this specific element. Let's just go for button. Oh no, styled button, to avoid any confusion. Now let's go to the style element and change how this button looks. So same as before, except we're referencing styled button instead. So we're going to style a pretty well-known button, which I'm sure you'll be able to figure out where it's from as we go along. Let's start by removing the border. We do this by typing border, none. I think I forgot to mention this, but always finish your CSS code with a semicolon. Now let's change the background colour of the button. There are of course built-in colours, but to get a more defined colour we'll type in RGB like this. We're going to go for a lightish blue, so I'm just going to put 255, which is the maximum value in the blue section. We can then hover over this little square here and that will allow us to select our own colour. I think we'll go for a nice lightish blue, not too dark. Okay, maybe a tad bit lighter than that, if it'll let us. There we go, now let's take a look. Nice. Okay, next let's make the text bold. You can do this with font-weight and then bold. You can also give it a value, but I find just typing bold is easier. Next let's change the font size. You do this with font-size. We'll go with 24 pixels. Okay, nice, that's a little bit more visible now, we can actually read it. Next let's change the text colour. So to change text colour it's just colour. I think we'll go with white. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Okay, next let's round off the corners of the button. To do this we need to change something called the border radius. Pretty much just defines how rounded the corners are. Let's start with a value like 12 pixels. Now hit save and there we have it, we have a nice rounded button. It is looking a bit cramped though, so let's fix that. We could do that by changing the width and doing something called padding. Let's set the width to 100 pixels just to start with. Okay, now it just looks more cramped. Let's just try adjusting this value a little bit. We'll go with 120. Okay, no, that's just like how it was to begin with. Let's go 160. There we go, that's good now. Right, so if we set the border radius to half of the width, which would be 80 pixels, then we'll get perfectly rounded edges. Something to do with maths. It's still looking a bit cramped vertically though. We could just change the height to fix this, but it's not the best way to do it because if you add more text then it might overflow and we don't want that. So we're going to look at something called padding. In this video we're going to look at 4 different ways to apply padding. Padding top, padding left, padding right, and padding bottom. Padding is just a way to add more space on the inside of an element. So for example, if you were to increase the padding left value on this button, the space to the left of the text would increase. Padding top would increase the space above the text, and so on and so forth. We'll get more into it as we go along, but that's the basics. Alright, let's start padding our button. Okay, let's set the padding top to something like 8 pixels. And then we'll just copy and paste this and change this to bottom so that they're both equal. The two opposite sides should really be equal, otherwise it's going to be off center and not look very good. Then we'll set padding left to 12 pixels. And the same for the other side. There we go, now let's take a look. Okay, cool, that's looking much better. But usually buttons don't say click me, so let's just change this text down here to something a bit more relatable. There we go. Now it is looking slightly too wide, so I'm just going to change the width to 140 pixels and the border radius to 70. And I'd say that looks about right now. So it's looking like a button that most of us have seen before, but usually when you hover over a button you want to get some sort of recognition that that's what you're doing, so let's sort that out. First thing we're going to want to do is create a new style for when we're hovering over our button. We do this by typing .styledButton and then followed by :hover. Now we'll turn the cursor into something that we call a pointer, which usually tells us if we press something then it's going to execute an action. To do this we type cursor : pointer. I'm trying to type it backwards for some reason. There we go, now let's test this out. Okay, that's feeling more like a button already. But I'd still like it to be a bit more interactive, like the button changing slightly. So let's give it something called a box shadow. And the first 2 values are the offset, so we won't worry about that, and the third value is the amount of shadow you would like. Something like 4 pixels should be okay. Now we need to give it a colour value. RGBA allows you to give a colour with an alpha, which is just like transparency. So 0, 0, 0 and 0.4 is just black with 40% opacity. There we go, that looks pretty good, but I'll just make it a little bit more obvious just for the video. Let's set the alpha to 0.7 and the pixels to 6. Okay, that's a lot more obvious now. We can also set the opacity of the button when we hover over it by typing opacity, colon, and the value. Let's go with 0.7. Now when we hover over it, it becomes slightly more see-through. Just going to up this value a little bit just so it's a little more subtle. Okay, that's looking pretty good. There's tons of properties you can change. We've barely scratched the surface here, but we'll get more into that in later videos. For now, we're just going to cover the basics. So far we've looked at the format of a HTML file, looked at some tags, styled some text, a button, changed how it responds when we hover over it. There's one last thing that we'll do, and that's changing what the button does when we press it or when it's activated. And then I think that'll be the end of this lesson. I'll try to keep them about 15 to 20 minutes long. This is done in a similar way to how we changed it when we hover over it, but instead of typing hover we type active. And the only thing that we're going to do for now is just change the opacity slightly, just to give us a slight indication that we're pressing the button. So let's go for a value like 0.95. Okay, now save it and let's see what that's done. Looks like a button press to me. Alright, I'm going to be ending this here before it gets too long anyway. So if you felt like you learned anything, feel free to give it a like or a comment, and a subscription would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.